Although born in Istanbul in 1875, George Lorraine Stampa was a British citizen, and his father was working there at the time as an architect of considerable reputation. But the family were forced to leave the Ottoman Empire in 1878 following a political uprising, and they relocated to rural Westmoreland in the north of England. In 1892, he attended Heatherley's Art School in London, and a year later went on to the prestigious Royal Academy schools up to 1895. But even before he'd completed his studies, he was having his work published in Punch magazine at the age of only 19. Once he'd completed his art education, he therefore slipped fairly effortlessly into full-time professional illustration. And in addition to his regular, by now ongoing appearances in Punch, Stampa also worked for several of London's illustrated weekly magazines, including The Bystander, The Humorous and The Sketch. Some of this work was reproduced in colour, but the defining quality of all his work was the remarkable energy and sense of animation created with deceptively loose but always expressive pen strokes. When war broke out in 1914, like others, this became the dominant theme of his humorous drawings. But they remained generally upbeat, and his mockery of the Germans was particularly mild compared to others. In the main, he avoided the brutal realities of the conflict, even in his portrayals of the British troops on the battlefield. In 1916, he also published a collection of his scruffy urban children depictions as a book titled Ragamuffins, as a work of comic escapism from the subject of the war. Once the war was over, it was business as usual for Stampa, and in addition to his magazine work, he branched out into posters, including a series of comical cautionary messages for London transport, although this departure from his usual terrain was short-lived. In 1921, he illustrated Urbanities and Specially Selected, two collections of essays by the Punch writer E.V. Lucas. And the pairing of Lucas's humorous anecdotal writing and Stampa's always consistently absorbing visual elaborations made for a particularly winning and popular combination. Both books were very popular with the public and sold in large numbers. Throughout the 1920s, Punch continued to be his main vehicle of expression, and although monochrome persisted as the primary form of reproduction, there were also an increasing number of examples of his work created with the overlay of particularly attractive watercolour washes. Stampa also developed a reputation for his ability to create amusing and highly plausible illustrations of dogs, and in these images he steered clear of overt anthropomorphic techniques, but nevertheless managed to imbue his characters with believable personality. And throughout the 1930s he illustrated numerous dog-themed books, including a couple by Rudyard Kipling. He remained a stalwart for Punch, and although his productivity declined in the later 1930s, he continued to contribute cartoons up to the later 1940s. During his career, he'd created somewhere in the region of 2,500 illustrations, and George Stampa died in 1951 at the age of 76. Leo Cheney was born in 1878 in Accrington in the northwest of England, not all that far from where I call home. Unfortunately, very little is recorded about him, although it is known that when he left school, he took a job in a local bank. But he was far from happy there, and in a bid to improve his drawing, he enrolled on Percy Bradshaw's cartoon correspondence course. He began having some success as a freelance illustrator and for a while as a staff cartoonist at the Manchester Evening News, but I found absolutely no evidence of any of his work until a 1914 cartoon published in Punch, and a tobacco press ad also published in the same magazine, by which time he was already 36 years old. But a year later he created the first in what would become a long-running series of popular press ads for Johnnie Walker Whiskey. The Striding Man mascot character had been originally created some years earlier by the cartoonist Tom Brown, and when Tom Brown died unexpectedly in 1909, others, including Punch cartoonist Bernard Partridge, were recruited to follow in his footsteps. Cheney took over during the war, and the campaign ran successfully with his images for 4 years, including full-page appearances in several American humor magazines of the period. Virtually all his output was black and white, and from the available visual evidence, it seems he worked pretty much exclusively for the Passing Show magazine. I did find this solitary colour cover he created in 1921, and a poster for rally motorbikes from the same period, which I would never have believed was his if it hadn't been signed. But all his other illustrations for the Passing Show were either line only or occasionally a half-tone grey was added quite unnecessarily, as the quality of his pen and ink drawing was already plausibly three-dimensional. The visual qualities of the satires he produced for many of the magazine's covers were uniformly well rendered and sensibly presented on usually blank white backgrounds to give the image and the magazine itself greater impact on the newsstand. The numerous images he created dealt with many aspects of life in post-war Britain and on the wider global stage, with considerable acuity, and he made great use of the political cartoonist device of employing various stereotypes and metaphors to drive his message home. A large amount of his work satirised the then British Prime Minister Lloyd George, with the supposedly hapless politician inevitably being the butt of the joke. The political nuances are largely wasted on the vast majority of us now, even in Britain, but even if we can't follow the meaning, the essential humour and application of graphic skill still make for particularly appealing work. His illustrations continued to appear in the Passing Show and apparently nowhere else into the later years of the 1920s. But unfortunately, Leo Cheney was yet another to feature in this series who bowed out early, in his case at the age of only 50 in 1928. William Ridgewell was born in Brighton, Sussex in 1881, and he went on to study at the School of Art there. In the early years of the 20th century, it's recorded that he worked as a commercial artist, but as is frequently and predictably the case, no evidence from this period exists. At the age of 33, he served in the British Army in India during the Great War, but once the war was over, he began submitting cartoons to Punch, and he quickly became one of a group of distinctive younger cartoonists who began to move away from the magazine's usually intensely cross-hatched approach in favour of a lighter and less anatomically observational style. In this regard, he was in the company of the exceptionally forward-looking and influential H.M. Bateman. Ridgewell also worked for quite a few other popular magazines, and like Leo Cheney, also appeared in the Passing Show, although with nothing like the same frequency. His humour was frequently good-natured, although on occasion more sardonic humour also appeared in his drawings. And alongside the Bateman influence, there were also echoes of the whimsical work of William Heath Robinson, which gelled very successfully with his somewhat minimal pen and ink technique. Usually his monochromes were line only, and where he wanted optical greys, he applied some fine linear shading effects. His command of spatial description was one of the most striking features of his images, and was the equal of the very best that Britain produced at that time, including Heath Robinson. And although the bulk of his work featured dialogue and captions, it was very much secondary to the quality of the more universal visual humour depicted in any given situation. In addition to his ongoing work for Punch and other magazines, he enjoyed considerable popular success with his comical illustrations for the book Ruthless Rhymes, written by Harry Graham. And it was particularly in this book that Ridgewell's images took an obvious delight in the misfortune of others in a series of more than usually lively comic illustrations. Like many of his peers, including the others featured in this instalment, Ridgewell's drawings had little need for colour, and most of his output was line only. But there were some occasions in the 1930s when he got to use full colour, and in colour he kept the line work even simpler and used washes of watercolour with very pleasing outcomes. With this technique he created some memorable and entertaining colour images for Pratt's Petrel, all of which play to his strengths as a creator of engrossing good-natured humour and descriptive evocations of speed and mayhem. And the series proved to be a very successful advertising campaign by seducing the potential customer with his universal comedy. I feel confident in asserting this would have led to more of a similar nature, but we'll never know, as just like Leo Cheney, William Ridgewell died prematurely, in his case in 1937, at the age of only 56. Leonard Robert Brightwell was born in Clapham, Surrey in 1889, and although the great majority of his illustration was humorous, unlike the others featured in this instalment, he had his more serious side too. He studied at London's Lambeth School of Art, and during his time as a student, he regularly indulged his fascination for wildlife by spending much of his time drawing animals in London's zoological gardens. His early start as an illustrator and wildlife artist was cut short when the war broke out in 1914 and he joined the army. He was lucky enough to survive the horrors and in 1918 began his career again with work for Punch and increasingly for book illustration. In 1920 his illustrated edition of the medieval folktale Reynard the Fox was published, and in addition to a large number of pages featuring highly expressive pen and ink monochrome spot illustrations, there were also a number of attractive absorbing compositions in full colour. Whether monochrome or colour, his innate understanding of animal anatomy and abilities with anthropomorphic techniques was obvious. In addition to his more humorous illustrations, Brightwell continued to create more serious-minded animal-themed dry-point etchings, which were exhibited frequently, and they sold well to collectors throughout his career. More books with animal subjects followed throughout the 1920s, featuring both full-colour and line-only images, including 1927's Taddy Tadpole, written by Olwen Bowen. Arguably, it was his affinity for the creation of animal characters which was the significant factor in his ongoing success. And Brightwell's association with Bowen continued to produce more successful books, several of which were also published widely in France. And into the 1930s, his success in publishing continued undiminished at home and abroad. 1937's Neptune's Garden was to an extent a more serious look at aquatic life, but even so he couldn't resist also creating some charming comic spot illustrations and page decorations throughout. In 1940 he created a series of jolly monochrome animal pictures for Boy's Own Comic. These images were an apparently effortless demonstration of Brightwell's ability to use pen and brush to create highly plausible comic renditions of the animal kingdom, and to imbue all his creations with real personality. More followed throughout the 1940s and into the 50s, some of which were played for laughs and others which were more overtly educational. The last dated work I found was the book Trimmer, The Tale of a Trawler Tyke, published in 1956, which he also wrote. This book contains some really absorbing pen and ink compositions of great accomplishment, and featured heavier than usual expressive hatching, which made the images even more compelling. I don't know if it actually was his last, but it made a fitting epitaph. And Leonard Brightwell died in Bodmin, Cornwall, in 1962 at the age of 73. Which brings us to the end of this 100th instalment, and although I'll be taking a break from the series to recharge my batteries, I'll be back before too long with the start of what I hope will be the next 100.